Hello and welcome to Through the Bible. Today is episode 39, Leviticus 17 through 20. In today's reading, we see that they are no longer allowed to sacrifice away from the entrance to the tent of meeting, that they will no longer be allowed to worship according to their own opinions or ideas, but only in a way that is accountable to God and to the priests and to the community. So they can't just go off and worship their own way. It's a part of the community. It's a part of the assembly. We see that spiritual independence is punished by excommunication. They're separated from the church, from the people, from the fellowship. God is calling for unity in worship. We see that God prohibits the eating and the drinking of blood as it represents life. In chapter 18, there is one God, one faith. He says, do not look to Egypt, do not look to other religions for how they do things. Look only to God and His prescriptions. He talks about that life stems from obedience to the Lord. In other words, if you serve the Lord, if you obey the Lord, if you follow His commandments, you will live. If you don't, then you will not. He goes on to talk about sexual fidelity. Prohibitions include incest and other things. We see that some of this covers indiscretions, and it's a correction to the way that things were done in the past when they didn't know any better. For example, the marriage of half-sisters or step-sisters, aunts, etc. Two sisters is another one that would be an example. Adultery, child sacrifice, all of those are prohibited. Do not injure God's name by what you do or say. Homosexuality, bestiality, these things were cultural, these things were practiced by the other nations, but they were not pleasing to God. He called it defilement, or in other words, pollution. It polluted what God had created them to be. In chapter 19, we see He says, be holy because I, the Lord, am holy. Holy being separate or uncommon, not common. Don't pick clean the harvest. In other words, leave some things behind. Don't feel like you've got to pick up every grape. Don't feel like you have to pick up every grain of wheat or whatever it happens to be. Leave some of that for the poor and the strangers in the community to be able to come behind you and be able to eat and be able to survive. Do not steal, do not act deceptively, do not lie, do not swear falsely. In other words, do not profane the Lord's name. We see that again. Do not oppress your neighbor. Do not rob your neighbor. Do not withhold or delay wages to workers. Do not curse the deaf. Do not cause the blind to stumble. Do not act unjustly. Do not be partial to the poor or show preferential treatment to the rich. In other words, there should be fair justice. That's why Lady Justice is blind in America, because we believe that we should have impartial justice. Do not spread slander. Do not jeopardize your neighbor's life. This is where we get a lot of our civil ideas from. Like if somebody falls into a hole that you dug on your property because you didn't warn them or something like that. Those are reasons why. These go all the way back to the Levitical law. Do not harbor hatred towards your brother. Do not take revenge against them. Do not bear grudge against members of your community. It also says not to cross breed or to cross materials, things like that. That seems a little funny today, but it has to do with God trying to teach them that mixture is a bad thing. They needed to be completely holy, not partially holy. There's a penalty for sexual sins that's mentioned. We see the consecration of the crops in the way that a fruit tree planted cannot be eaten from for several years, and then it's dedicated unto the Lord, then it can be eaten from. Do not practice divination. Do not practice witchcraft. Do not place upon your body spiritual marks that were used by the godless culture, tattoos and engravings and markings and things like that were put on the body to represent other religions, to memorialize the dead, things like that were actually pagan practices. People get confused today. They wonder why that is and why people today don't worry about it. It's because there's a difference between a flower on your arm, for example, and the marks that represented false gods. Do not prostitute your daughter. Do not consult mediums or spiritualists, horoscopes, all of those kind of things. Do not oppress the aliens or the strangers that are in your land, but treat them as if they are native born. Don't be unfair in your measurements, your weights, your volume. Remember in those days that they would weigh out things and that would determine the price of things. People would use false weights or inaccurate weights in order to gain business leverage or business advantage over somebody else. The Bible condemns that, and that's why we need to be careful today when we see those kind of things take place. There's some things the Bible tells us that we should do as well. It tells us that we should judge our neighbors fairly. It says that we should rebuke them directly. In other words, if you've got a problem with somebody, tell them exactly what's bothering you. Tell them exactly what's on your mind. Maybe in your conversation they will ask forgiveness, or maybe in the conversation you will realize that things aren't the way that you thought they were. To love your neighbor as yourself, to keep God's statutes, to keep the Sabbath, to revere God's sanctuary, to rise in the presence of the elderly when they come in, and to honor the old. Imagine if we could do that today, how much better life would be. To fear God, to keep statutes and ordinances, to set yourself apart. All of these things are a part of the Levitical law, and many of these things today, when we see them in the proper perspective, not seeing them as just a tattoo, but recognizing what that tattoo was used for, while it may be okay to use one type of tattoo on your body, maybe it's not okay to do another, and we should prayerfully consider those things before we just do them. There's penalties mentioned in chapter 20 for violations, and the Bible also tells us in Leviticus 20 to obey God so that we can keep the possession that He gives us, talking specifically here about the promised land that they're getting ready to go into. But today, the blessings, the things that God does for us, we don't want to lose those because we ignore Him or to walk away from Him. So there you go for Leviticus 17 through 20. See you next time. God bless.